when a 5-year-old boy interrupted a private meeting between Elon Musk and Pope Francis, no one expected the question he'd ask, or the answer that would leave Elon speechless, his eyes brimming with tears. What did this child see that the world's greatest minds missed? The truth unfolds in a moment that stuns the entire room. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The warm glow of the setting sun spilled gently across the rooftops of Vatican City, casting long golden shadows over the timeless architecture. Inside the apostolic palace, the air was hushed, reverent, thick with centuries of history. Ornate ceilings stretched overhead, and paintings of saints and scholars watched silently from the walls, their eyes seeming to follow the footsteps of those walking the corridor below. Among them was Elon Musk, walking quietly beside his young son X. The boy, just 5 years old, clutched his father's hand with both curiosity and caution. Elon, dressed in modest yet respectful attire, moved slowly, each step thoughtful. The usual air of unshakable confidence was absent. Today his expression carried something else, something softer. Contemplation, perhaps even uncertainty. They passed through archways gilded with history, their quiet footsteps echoing across the polished marble floor. Around them stood figures from across the globe, scientists, ethicists, and spiritual leaders, each one hand-picked for this unprecedented gathering on faith, technology, and the moral path ahead. Soft murmurs filled the corridor as guests exchanged quiet words, their attention drawn toward a chamber at the far end. Inside that chamber waited Pope Francis. He was not a figure of spectacle, but one of serene presence. Clad in simple white, the Pope radiated a calm, quiet strength. He was here not to preach, but to listen, to welcome dialogue from minds shaped by science, logic, and ambition. X looked up at his father, then back toward the chamber. His eyes were wide, filled with wonder and something deeper. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He was absorbing it all, the majesty, the silence, the meaning of the moment. What neither of them knew was that something extraordinary was about to unfold. A question, an answer, a transformation. The gathering settled into the intimate chamber, where Pope Francis stood with open arms and a warm smile. He welcomed Elon Musk with grace and sincerity, his voice calm but resonant. "Today," the Pope said gently, "we do not come to debate, but to understand. Let us speak not only of technology, but also of the soul." Elon nodded, his demeanor humble, a rare stillness in his usually fast-pacing world. The discussion began with artificial intelligence and moved into the ethics of innovation. Pope Francis spoke of human dignity. Elon shared thoughts on progress and responsibility. The atmosphere was thoughtful, respectful. But then, just as the dialogue found its rhythm, a small hand tugged at Elon's sleeve. Startled, he looked down. "I have a question too," X whispered softly, eyes wide but steady. Elon hesitated, uncertain. All eyes turned to the boy, but Pope Francis raised a hand gently and nodded. "Let him speak," he said with a kind smile. "Sometimes the deepest questions come from the smallest voices." X stepped forward, his voice trembling but clear. "Can someone believe in science and also believe in God? Can both be true?" The room fell completely silent. Even Elon held his breath. In the weeks leading up to the summit, Elon Musk had been quieter than usual. Though his public persona remained focused on innovation, behind closed doors, he'd been wrestling with something more personal, something deeper. For most of his life, Elon leaned heavily on logic, reason, and data. He spoke often about the future of humanity, space exploration, and the promise of technology. But when conversations turned toward faith, he typically deflected, not out of disrespect, but uncertainty. He had never fully reconciled the language of science with the language of the soul. At home, it was his son X who had begun to nudge that door open. Just 5 years old, X had already shown an astonishing curiosity about the universe. He asked questions most adults hesitated to voice. One night, while looking up at the stars through a telescope, he turned to his father and asked, "Who made the stars?" Another evening, during a quiet moment before bed, he asked, "Who made love?" Elon, caught off guard by the simplicity and depth of the questions, didn't offer quick answers. Instead, he encouraged more questions. Their home overflowed with inventions and books, but recently, the nature of X's questions had shifted. He no longer wanted to know just how things worked. He wanted to know why they mattered. That quiet yearning led Elon to bring him to the Vatican gathering, not as a publicity gesture, but as a father hoping to expose his son to voices that spoke of morality, meaning, and purpose. Elon had hoped the experience would be enriching, but he never imagined X would speak up, let alone ask a question that pierced so directly into the heart of an ancient debate. Across the room, Pope Francis recognized the weight of the moment. He'd heard thousands of questions in his lifetime, many from presidents and philosophers. But this one was different. This one was pure. Pope Francis turned to X, his expression warm and thoughtful. "That is a beautiful question," he said gently, "and it is one that many wise people have asked for centuries." The Pope knelt slightly so he could meet the child at eye level, his voice carrying the weight of experience and compassion. "Faith and science are not enemies," he continued. "They are different languages describing the same truth." His eyes widened slightly as he listened. "Am I like two wings of the same bird?" the Pope said, turning now to address the entire room. "One helps us understand the world. The other gives that understanding meaning. When they work together, the soul can soar." Elon shifted in his seat, his brow furrowed slightly in thought. "But faith can't be proven," he said after a pause. "That's the struggle. Science relies on evidence, repeatable results. Faith seems to ask us to accept what we can't see." Pope Francis smiled, not dismissively but kindly. "And yet, Mr. Musk, love too is invisible. We cannot see it under a microscope. We cannot measure it with an instrument. But it defines our lives. Would you say love is not real?" Elon gave a small nod. "I suppose I'd say it's real, but not because it's measurable. Because we feel it." "Exactly," the Pope said softly, "and in that feeling there is something true, something powerful. Science gives us tools to improve life. Faith teaches us why life is worth improving." The audience remained still, caught between two voices, one representing the cutting edge of human achievement, the other representing centuries of spiritual wisdom. It was not a clash. It was a conversation. And that made it even more compelling. Elon leaned back slightly, his gaze settling on his son, who now sat quietly, his small fingers folded together. X looked up at him, then at the Pope, his young face glowing with wonder and intent. He wasn't just watching, he was absorbing, learning, perhaps even believing. "I've always thought," Elon said slowly, "that science was the only reliable path forward. That if we just understood more, we'd solve everything. Disease, conflict, even loneliness. But sometimes, I wonder if all my searching for stars is really a search for meaning." The Pope nodded slowly, the corners of his eyes softening. "It's a noble search," he said, "and you've brought light to the world in ways few ever will. But the stars themselves, beautiful as they are, do not tell us why we long to reach them. That longing, I believe, comes from the soul." A gentle murmur rippled through the room, not in disruption but in recognition. Something in the air had shifted. The tone of the conversation was no longer academic. It had become deeply human. Elon's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough to notice. He wasn't debating, he was listening, really listening. The skepticism had not disappeared, but it was now joined by something else, a growing openness. X reached for his father's hand, resting it gently in his own. Elon looked down, and for a brief moment their eyes met. In that silent exchange, something passed between them, a sense of quiet understanding. Pope Francis observed them with a soft smile, then turned back to the gathering. "Science and faith, when held together with humility," he said, "can help us not only build better machines, but build better hearts." The words lingered in the space, echoing off the high ceilings like a quiet blessing. The conversation was far from over, but its tone had changed. The distance between logic and belief had begun to narrow, bridged not by arguments, but by something far simpler. A question, a pause, and the courage to listen. Back home in California, the atmosphere inside the Musk household had shifted. The conversations, once dominated by new technologies, rocket designs, and future missions to Mars, had taken on a different tone. The Vatican meeting lingered in everyone's mind, especially X's. Days after returning, while the family sat around the dinner table, the young boy looked up from his plate and asked quietly, "If science knows so much, why do we still need God?" Elon set his fork down slowly. The room grew still. He glanced at Grimes, who looked equally surprised by the question, though not startled. Elon leaned forward, resting his arms on the table, and replied with gentle honesty, "Well, science helps us understand how things work, how stars are born, how cells grow, how time moves forward. But sometimes the why behind it all is still missing." X's brow furrowed slightly, the gears turning in his young mind. "You mean science doesn't have all the answers?" Elon smiled faintly. "It has a lot, but not everything." Grimes joined in, her tone soft and reflective. "Some things aren't easy to measure, like music, like art. I've always felt that those things connect us to something deeper, something spiritual. I don't always have words for it, but I feel it." X tilted his head, thinking. Then he asked, "So, is love science or God?" The room went quiet again. Elon looked across the table at his son, surprised by the question's simplicity and its weight. He took a breath before answering. "Maybe it's both," he said. "Science can explain how love works in our brains, chemicals, reactions, but why we love the way we do, why we sacrifice for each other, why we feel joy when we give, that might be something more, something we don't fully understand." X nodded slowly, not with full certainty, but with interest. He wasn't just asking to be clever. He truly wanted to know. Their home, once a temple to reason and invention, had begun to hum with new questions. Not the kind that appeared in blueprints or graphs, but the kind that appeared late at night when the world was quiet and the heart was loud. Later that evening, Elon stood outside X's bedroom door, listening to the soft rustle of sheets as his son settled into bed. He entered quietly, sitting beside him on the edge of the mattress. "Dad?" X whispered in the darkness. "Did I say something wrong at the Vatican?" Elon shook his head, reaching out to brush the boy's hair gently. "No," he said softly. "You said something very right." X looked up at him. "It just felt important." Elon's voice dropped to a near whisper. "It was important. Your question, it opened something in me, something I hadn't looked at in a long time." X smiled faintly, his eyes growing heavy with sleep. "I still have more questions." "I hope you never stop," Elon replied, leaning down to kiss his forehead. "Questions are good, even the hard ones." As he rose to leave, he paused in the doorway, looking back at the small figure curled beneath the covers. There was a sense that something meaningful had begun, not with a debate, not with an invention, but with a child's honest curiosity. A door had been opened, and for the first time, Elon wasn't afraid to walk through it. He stood for a moment longer, letting the silence settle around him like a gentle answer he didn't yet fully understand. Then he turned off the light and quietly closed the door behind him. Just a few days after the Vatican visit, as Elon began returning to the usual whirlwind of meetings, prototypes, and deadlines, a call came that shattered the calm. A serious accident had occurred at Tesla's Nevada Gigafactory. A power unit under experimental testing had malfunctioned, resulting in a violent explosion. Several workers were injured. One man, a senior engineer named Matthew Everett, was in critical condition. Elon immediately cleared his schedule and boarded a jet. During the flight, he said very little, but the tension in his jaw and the distant look in his eyes spoke volumes. Matthew had been with Tesla from the early years, a quiet, loyal team member who never sought recognition but was essential to the progress Elon had long envisioned. As his plane descended over the Nevada desert, the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on him. He felt it not just as a CEO, but as a human being who had made choices that affected lives. At the hospital, Elon was met by company personnel and ushered into the intensive care wing. Machines hummed softly around Matthew's bed. Tubes and monitors surrounded him. His wife, Sarah, sat beside him holding his hand, her eyes puffy but dry. Their teenage daughter, Olivia, stood nearby, still and silent. When Sarah saw Elon, she rose from her seat, trying to muster composure. "Thank you for coming," she said, voice trembling. "I wouldn't be anywhere else," Elon replied, his voice low. "We'll do everything we can, I promise." A moment later, Olivia stepped forward. She was barely a teenager, but her gaze was steady. "My dad believed in you," she said. "He thought working for you meant he was part of something bigger, something good." Elon looked at her, and his throat tightened. He nodded, unable to speak. Those words, so sincere, so undeserved in his mind, cut deeply. In that moment, the ambition, the scale, the innovation all faded behind one truth. People had trusted him with more than just their time. They had trusted him with their lives. He stepped out into the hallway to gather himself, his thoughts spinning. That was when he saw Grimes gently leading X toward him. She didn't say anything, just gave a small nod, sensing that Elon needed his son more than anyone else right now. X walked slowly, eyes scanning the sterile hallway and the faces of worried people moving around him. Without hesitation, he walked over to the small waiting area where Olivia had retreated. He sat beside her, quietly. At first, neither of them spoke. Then X turned to her and said, "My dad says, sometimes something good can come from something hard. I think he really means it." Olivia didn't respond right away, but after a moment she whispered, "I hope so." Elon watched from a distance, stunned by the calm and comfort his son offered without effort or pretense. It wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't grand. It was just sincere. And it was exactly what was needed. He realized that in this young boy, whose heart hadn't yet been jaded by logic or hardened by loss, there lived a kind of wisdom he couldn't define, one that his own endless pursuit of answers had never quite reached. Elon felt something stir inside, fragile, unfamiliar, not logic, not knowledge. Something more like grace. He lowered himself to sit on a nearby bench, silent, reflective, and suddenly deeply aware of the kind of strength that doesn't come from intellect, but from empathy. His son was teaching him again, not with inventions or facts, but with presence, with love. Later that evening, after the hospital visit, Elon sat alone in his hotel room. The walls felt unusually quiet, the soft hum of the city beyond the window doing little to settle the thoughts turning over in his mind. He glanced at his phone, the screen dark. The room around him was filled with the stillness that only comes after an emotional storm. He stared at a blank page in his notebook, his hand hovering over a pen. Then, almost without thinking, he began to write. It wasn't long or elaborate, just a simple note addressed to the Vatican. "Your Holiness, I humbly ask that you keep Matthew Everett and his family in your prayers. He is a valued engineer and a good man. His daughter reminded me today of how deeply we impact the lives of those who trust us. I don't know how to carry this burden, but I hope faith might help." He didn't expect a reply, and yet a few hours later one arrived. Delivered quietly by a Vatican aide to the hotel front desk, the envelope bore the papal seal and a single line of handwritten text. "Elon, be assured of my prayers for Matthew, for his family, and for you. Faith and love carry us through our darkest hours. Francis." Elon read the message once, then again. Something about its quiet certainty struck him deeply. There were no formulas, no solutions, just presence. Compassion. Humanity. When he returned home a few days later, still processing the events of the week, he found X waiting for him with a book in hand. The cover was worn, the edges frayed from countless readings. It was a copy of Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. "My teacher gave this to me," X said, holding it out. "She said it might help answer some of the questions I had." Elon took the book carefully, flipping through its pages. Lines were underlined, notes were scribbled in the margins by previous readers. He sat down on the couch and X climbed up beside him. They opened to a section titled "Right and Wrong as a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe." For the next hour, father and son read together in silence, pausing occasionally to talk about what they were reading. X asked if science and faith had to be at war. Elon shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "I think they're looking at the same truth from different angles. Science tells us how the stars are made. Faith reminds us why they're beautiful." X leaned his head on his father's arm, visibly comforted. Elon looked down at the book again, then back at his son. "Maybe truth isn't only in telescopes and data," he said softly. "Maybe it's also in the heart, in love, in questions we don't have answers for yet." That night, something shifted. Elon didn't claim to have found every answer, but he'd found a new kind of peace, one not built on certainty, but on the courage to keep asking, and the willingness to listen. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of Elon's life slowly resumed. Projects resumed, meetings stacked up, deadlines loomed, yet something inside him had shifted. When he was invited to deliver a keynote at a global summit in Rome on technology and ethics, he accepted without hesitation. It was the kind of stage he had stood on many times before, but this time, he carried something different. His speech began as expected. He spoke of advancements in artificial intelligence, breakthroughs in renewable energy, and the long-term vision for colonizing Mars. The crowd of global leaders, scientists, and innovators listened intently, nodding at each ambitious proposal. But halfway through, Elon paused. He looked out over the audience, then glanced down at the notes in his hand. Notes he no longer needed. "My son," he said quietly, "asked me a question science couldn't answer. He asked if someone could believe in both science and God." He paused, letting the words linger. "That question changed me. It reminded me that knowledge is powerful, but it's not everything. We need wisdom too. We need humility, and we need heart." The room was completely silent. "I've spent my life building the future, but maybe the most important thing we build is how we treat one another, how we carry love, responsibility, and purpose alongside innovation." As he finished, the auditorium erupted into a standing ovation. Cameras flashed, people wiped their eyes, and in a quiet corner of the Vatican, Pope Francis, watching the broadcast, smiled. That night, back home in California, Elon and X stood outside beneath a sky full of stars. The air was cool and quiet. "Do you think Pope Francis prays for other people too?" X asked softly. Elon looked up at the night sky and smiled. "I think he already does." A few days later, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from Matthew Everett, now miraculously recovered and back home with his family. Elon opened it slowly, unfolding the handwritten note. As X sat beside him, he read it aloud. "Your compassion," the letter said, "saved more than just my life. It reminded my family that even in great minds, there can be great heart. Thank you." Elon folded the letter carefully, resting it in his lap. He looked down at his son, who leaned quietly against his side. "You taught me something," Elon said softly, "that questions, especially the hard ones, can guide us home." The two of them sat in silence, bathed in the soft glow of the stars above. Their silhouettes blended into the night, one small and full of wonder, the other older, but now deeply changed. In an age of doubt, it wasn't certainty that changed Elon Musk. It was a child's honest question and a gentle answer from a man of faith. Subscribe for more inspiring stories of innocence, wisdom, and life's unexpected awakenings.